So if you're a fan of live music, you know that nothing can match the thrill and the intensity of seeing an artist or a band you love in a small venue. But that's becoming less possible right now. Today on the podcast, you'll hear about why Canada's small music venues are disappearing. I'm Elamin Abdelmahmoud. This is Commotion. Listen, I think maybe the right place to start is here. That is new music from Toronto's Metric. This song is called Who Would You Be For Me? Metric are clearly among the most successful indie rock bands this country has produced. This month, they're going to be playing a big sold-out show in Toronto, also in New York, LA, London, Paris. But in order to get there, they refined their skills by playing much smaller venues about 20 years ago. We're talking about rooms like Reverb in Toronto, or Call the Office in London, or Richards on Richards in Vancouver. And all of these rooms don't exist anymore. Actually, there's a growing concern that the small concert venue is becoming an endangered species in this country. And it's not like gentrification, inflation, and the pandemic are helping matters at all. So how can we make sure that young artists actually have spaces in order to hone their skills? We have gathered a special Commotion group chat on the state of the small music venue here in Canada. We got Jonathan Bunce, a.k.a. Johnny Dovercourt, who heads up the concert series Wavelength in Toronto. Dan Seligman is a creative director of the Pop Montreal Festival. And Leah Abramson is a musician, composer, and playwright based in Vancouver. Dan, Jonathan, Leah, welcome to the show. I'm so happy that you're here. What's up, everybody?
Great to be here.
Hey.
Hey.
How's it going, Elamin?
I'm doing all right so far. Listen, Johnny, I'm going to start with you. You recently co-wrote a University of Toronto study about small venue closures across Ontario. When you look at the data, what does that data tell us?
Well, before the pandemic, we looked at concert listings data, which was a really interesting, like new innovative source of data for actually finding out what's happening with venues. And anecdotally, everyone in the music scene had seen venues close, especially in the years before COVID in Toronto, especially in 2017. We saw venues like the Holyoke and the Silver Dollar and Soy Bomb and the Hawks and all closed down. But we actually wanted to look and see, so what does the data tell us? Like, are venues actually closing at a higher rate than normal, or is this just sort of regular business churn? And we did see from pulling info from Exclaim and just shows concert data that concert activity in Ontario peaked around the mid-2010s and then really started to decline before the pandemic. So It wasn't just the number of active venues, it was also the number of active shows, like the amount of activities. That was really interesting. And then we saw, obviously, COVID shut everything down. And now, like, coming back out of COVID, we saw that in Toronto, 15% of all our small venues closed down permanently.
When we really say that kids are not going out as much, we really mean that. They're just not going to as many shows, literally because there's not as many shows available. Operating a venue, I should say, Johnny, has always been this precarious business. It's not like the margins have been massive. They've got razor-thin margins to begin with. What feels different to you about this particular moment?
Well, I think that we're seeing in some changes in audience behavior. There's sort of more of a flight to familiarity. So you're seeing the large venues and tours are all doing great. They're all packed and selling out, and people are complaining they can't get tickets for the better known artists. But there's more of a struggle than ever to attract audiences for emerging artists and in grassroots venues. And it's really up and down. I mean, some smaller shows are sold out, and some are empty. I think like what's really, I think, scary is what's coming down the road, because during the pandemic, we saw generous government subsidies that really helped a lot of these businesses get back on their feet after these shutdowns and closures. Right. And now we're starting to see funding and subsidies cut back to pre-pandemic levels, but with post-pandemic inflation and higher costs.
Dan, you've been running the Pop Montreal Festival for over 20 years now, and your event really helped put Montreal on the global music scene. But to advertise the festival this year, that festival just happened just last month, you launched a billboard campaign that read R.I.P. Mile End. That's a neighborhood that your festival is centered around. Fighting words, man. What's been going on there that inspired that billboard?
Well, it was kind of more of like a provocative, tongue-in-cheek statement about some of the conversations surrounding the neighborhood in the last couple of years. There's been a lot of talk about small mom and pop businesses closing, potential erection of a large boutique hotel.
Yeah.
So it was really like, in some ways, just trying to get people's attention. It's so hard to kind of break through any kind of visual pollution these days that we just wanted to make a statement, and it clearly worked. People are talking about it in Toronto, so that's, I guess, a good thing. But yeah, I mean, it wasn't like, okay, people also didn't understand it, which was kind of interesting, but it did get people's attention, which ultimately was the point of the billboard. Like previous years, we've had like billboards with like the, listing some of the artists playing, some of the headline artists, and, people see it, but it doesn't really like grab people's attention. Now, with the RIP Mile End billboard, people were sharing it on Instagram, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess that was the point of it, but it was also to draw attention to some of the issues that we're talking about today, venue closing, all the problems surrounding gentrification and, underground artists are always kind of on their margins. Small venues are always kind of on their margins. And as Johnny was saying, because of the pandemic, it's kind of just like push things further towards like, potential collapse. So it's not like, I think, you got to talk about it. You got to draw attention to it in order to kind of like, help save whatever we have going,
Well, I was going to say, you say it's tongue in cheek, but also that something about that campaign sort of resonated with people. And maybe the reason people started posting the billboard that they saw is because there's a kernel of truth there that really resonated with people. Do you feel like you're ready to mourn Mile End? Is that where you're already at?
I mean, like part of it is nostalgia. Everyone talks about like, the heyday of the Mile End 20 years ago or 15 years ago. But I mean, I'm not naive enough to not know that like, neighborhoods are constantly changing. Gentrification affects all kinds of different neighborhoods. And, the creative class, musicians, artists, festivals are all part of that like gentrification process. So I think it's just about being kind of cognizant and self-aware of like everyone's place in the process of gentrification and doing what we can to not only preserve whatever cultural institutions exist, but also like engage people in the dialogue of like what it means to be a musician, an artist, a presenter, and like how we all affect each other as like a society.
Leah, Johnny earlier mentioned that like concerts kind of peaked in the mid 2000s. You're a musician who started playing small venues in Vancouver, going back to that period of time. What changes have you observed since then over that period of time?
Yeah, it's actually interesting listening to you two talk about that, because I feel like Vancouver's been going through this for quite some time already. Like, the Olympics kind of came to town, and when that development happened, and actually quite a bit before that, like when the development was getting ready, people got pushed out, development started, things got torn down, real estate started rising super high, and so we saw a lot of venues closing at that point, and just, development has just continued. So I think like we've actually been trying to like sound the alarm. Like there was a documentary in 2010 called No Fun City. Vancouver also has a lot of kind of terrible bylaws that make small venues really hard here anyway. So we've been seeing this for quite some time already, and have, been struggling. And there's been lots of artists who have left and gone to Toronto and Montreal. And, there's these sort of waves of people who have left. But the people who stay here are resilient and scrappy, and, we figure things out.
I was going to say, what is the effect of having all that development kind of crowd out artists? Because it sounds like on the one hand, you'd have fewer and fewer spaces, but on the other, you kind of become maybe tighter knit in a way.
Yeah, I think like people help each other out, and DIY spaces here are a necessity. Like it's just because of the bylaws anyway, there's lots of places that, you know, can have music, but no dancing, things like that. Right. So we've always had our spaces, and, you know, maybe especially right now, they might pop up for a year or two and then close down because the building gets sold, and then pop up again. And that happens a lot here.
Johnny, I just want to give people who are listening a sense of what we miss out on when we lose these venues. Take a listen to this.
I'm going to do this song now that that I wrote about 5 years ago, that I haven't sung in about 4.5 years. Sugar Mountain.
Can you imagine just being at a coffee house in 1968 and Neil Young is he's just like, hey, can I just work out some material in front of all of you before he becomes the Neil Young that he is? So that's Neil Young there. He's performing at a coffee house, 1968. He famously cut his teeth in Yorkville in Toronto. That is a neighborhood that went from being this like artsy, hippie hub that eventually gentrified and then is now one of the city's most expensive areas. And that is a narrative that you see over and over and over again. But when you did your study, Johnny, on venue closures, you weren't really focused on gentrification. You think this is more about the actual small venue business model. Can you just elaborate a little bit on how that's at play?
Yeah, reimagining music venues isn't really technically about closures. We're looking at we were really looking at the entire live music ecosystem in Ontario, and the importance of small venues really sort of shone through in that. And prior to this study, I wrote a book called Any Night of the Week, which talked about the importance of small venues to Toronto historically, going back to Yorkville. And you've actually Neil Young only got a few gigs in Toronto and Yorkville before having to drive south to make it big in LA.
Right.
That was really Yorkville, and its destruction by the city was really one of the earliest instances of gentrification in the city. And so there's obviously like a 50 plus year history of art getting sort of pushed to the margins. What came out of the study, though, is a sort of a recognition across the ecosystem. We talked to everyone. We talked to artists. We talked to venue operators. We talked to promoters. And we talked to audience members as well. Everyone values live music. And almost everyone, pretty much everyone, also recognizes that it's endangered. So we all sort of come to the table with this recognition that the things aren't good, that the small venues, it's the grassroots venues, the places under 300 capacity. This is where artists get to step on the stage for the first time, get to try out new things, get to incubate their craft, and also get to connect with the community. Right. That's the most important thing, is that sense. That's where the local community is built. I made almost all my best friends from going to gigs and playing gigs. Like that's where everyone who's into music builds their social network. Yeah. Is through this kind of, and it's an informal network. All these venues, they all just kind of came up organically. Like most business owners who started booking bands didn't go into it saying, I'm going to start a cultural center. You know, if you did, like the Cameron House being in Toronto being an exception. Sure. But for the most part, it's sort of this unintentional community that develops.
Well, actually, I have an interesting point, or at least question for Johnny, because a lot of what you're saying made me think about like the early, like nascent stages of the internet and like communities building on social message boards and like, really being a focal point of indie communities and small shows. And now it's much, much harder. Like now we're talking about the algorithm, and we're talking about, what you were mentioning before about like these massive artists selling out. And it's like, yeah, Taylor Swift is selling out every concert in the world, but like you can't even like spread the you can't even spread the news about like your small band playing at the Cameron House or whatever. And
Yeah, exactly.
has the internet changed like initially we were like, oh, we're so excited we can build these communities on the internet, on message boards, etc. And now it's like it's gone in a way.
It sounds like there's quite a bit of mourning to go through as we sort of lose some of these institutions. Leah, we should say earlier this year you used the small venue crisis in Vancouver as the basis for an interactive art project. Can you just explain a little bit what you did and what you learned as you were making it?
Yeah, so actually I was asked to do a walking tour by Performance Festival for the industry, basically. And I just kept walking around and passing old venues that were gone and like reminiscing. And then around the same time, a friend posted something like a guitar player who's like, I used to play all these places. I love them. They're gone. And just these like long lists of venues that had closed. And it just, it was kind of amazing because the whole community started posting all these memories that they had of all these places. And there were different generations posting different venues. And, I was like, wow, there's just this outpouring of people and memories. And some of those places, especially the smaller spaces, DIY spaces, they only exist in the memories of people. Like there's no trace of them at all.
Yeah.
And yeah, just that outpouring of memory made me realize there was this real desire to remember and to have a space for those memories. So yeah, I did a collaborative map of venues, past, present, current, defunct, unclear, where people could just add their own stuff.
My name is Elamin Abdelmahmoud. You're listening to Commotion. On today's podcast, I'm talking to Jonathan Bunce in Toronto, Dan Seligman in Montreal, and Leah Abramson in Vancouver about all the small music venue closures that we've been seeing across the country. Johnny, we're going to try to talk a little bit about solutions, right? We've been talking about the problems that small venues are facing, but let's talk about how we solve some of these. What are some of the ways we can protect our venues and make play music more viable for all these up-and-coming artists?
Yeah, I mean, reimagining music venues, the study that I worked on, like the subtitle was Towards New Models of Conservation and Innovation for Live Music. Yeah. So there's tools that could be put in place to preserve existing venues. And Toronto, to its credit, has done its best within our sort of broken political system to do what it can. For example, Toronto put in a property tax rebate for music venues, which might not sound like a lot, but actually has made a difference to a lot of existing venues. That's one thing. The city has no power to stop to stop rent increases. That's in the hands of the province, and they have no interest in doing that for housing, let alone commercial spaces.
Right.
So that's one. There are tools like that exist to help existing venues, but a lot of this, the point of this study was like, what are new models just for venue operation that we can look at? And we put out a whole sort of suite of new models and policy recommendations. Some are sort of these small scale interventions, like the idea of a stage truck, encouraging cities to create programs to create basically a food truck for live music or performance that could bring live music outside of downtown cores. We saw in the study that across the province, downtown areas are really where you see like 90% of all live music activity. And the suburban areas, maybe outside the core, are really starved for opportunities for entertainment. So that's one idea. The city of Toronto has actually done a really interesting pilot of a space on Queen Street called It's Okay Studios, where the city has actually given over a city-owned building to a local arts group, a Black-led collective called It's Okay, to create a multidisciplinary arts center that involves live music as well as visual art and photography and filmmaking and co-working.
Right.
So that's a really interesting new model that I think there's a lot of hope that might lead to, be a template that could be used elsewhere. And then there's looking at new models of ownership, the idea of a cultural land trust, or in affordable housing, it's called a community land trust. The idea of the community actually owning space, which is huge, right? Would really change things. And the idea of taking cultural venues or music venues out of this really hostile, uncertain real estate market where you can, have your rent increased all of a sudden with no warning, or, get booted out for a redevelopment. The idea of a space being perpetually affordable is huge. And in the UK, there's a group called the Music Venue Trust that have just opened up their first community-owned venue.
Let me put this to Dan. Dan, what do you make of like the future of small venues and how it's tied up with maybe philanthropy efforts being the answer to this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of it. Pop Montreal just became a charity organization earlier this year. So
well done.
Thank you. Yeah. So, I mean, that's one of the things where, like, I think it is important to invest not only on a governmental, private sector level, but, like reimagining what we can do as like, underground indie music, quote unquote, indie music. Like, there's this huge landscape of philanthropy for opera and the symphony and, all the like, quote unquote, fine arts. But why can't we do that with underground, culture? Like, I think that's something that we need to imagine. And I think it's there. It's just like we need to kind of like come together and brainstorm. There are people like, I just had a conversation with someone who's been volunteering at Pop Montreal for 15 years. And she came up to me and she's like, I've been volunteering all this time. It's my favorite festival. And then she tells me, oh, I run like a charity wing for McGill and all this stuff. And I'd love to help you kind of establish, fundraising and that kind of thing. So I think, like that's one avenue in towards, making things more sustainable and long term. But I think, it's a multi-tier approach. Like we have to petition the city. Like it's great. Like Montreal is a great cultural, vibrant, thriving, artistic city. There's the Quartier des Spectacles, the Place des Festivals. There's all this stuff, infrastructure built by the city but it's very large scale, and we can't forget about the small venues that are DIY, that build the grassroots, that allow a metric to kind of thrive and sell out arenas. Like they have to start somewhere, and part of that is just like allowing space to happen. And even like this Canadian writer Shane Shapiro, who's based in the UK, he just put out a book, This Must Be the Place, how music can make your city better. Like there are studies, the economic cultural studies, that show how important music is to the cultural landscape of the city, and panels like this, and just people working on the ground, just making sure that administrations know that it's important to kind of help protect these institutions.
Leah, we got about a minute left, but you earlier mentioned DIY spaces. How do you see artists navigating this current reality in Vancouver?
Yeah, I mean, I was talking with a friend. I went to a show at like a dance rehearsal space on the weekend. And I know that, people are starting to partner with a lot of different kinds of arts. Like there's lots of interdisciplinary stuff happening where people will kind of give people space in kind. There's lots of collaboration, lots of artists supporting each other, that kind of stuff that's happening right now. Because, people can't be sort of siloed off in their own little genres or spaces anymore. People really have to come together and support each other and help each other out with the resources they have.
I think that is a perfect place to leave it. In the meantime, I appreciate all of you being on the show. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate you being here.
Thanks so much.
Thanks so much.
Of course. Jonathan Bunce, also known as Johnny Dovercourt, is the artistic and executive director of Wavelength Music Arts Project in Toronto. Dan Seligman is a founder of the annual Pop Montreal Music Festival, and Leah Abramson is a multidisciplinary artist based in Vancouver. And that is it for the podcast today. My name is Elamin Abdelmahmoud. It's been a delight being here with you today. I'm going to be here tomorrow, so if you're going to be here, I'd love to see you then.